Practical Theology and Theological Reflection. My Father is working, and I am working still. That's John 5, verse 17. What is theology? Theology, at its fundamental level, is talk about God. Whilst theology might appear to some to concern only a systematic organisation, exploration and explanation of doctrine and belief, theology is in fact wedded to practice. Theology cannot be divorced from the living expression of faith. It is dynamic. Doing theology is a dynamic process. This has been embodied in history in the Anglican tripartite combination of scripture, reason and tradition, and its adaptation by the Wesleys, which also included experience, to produce what has become known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral. The different perspectives all contribute to the doing of theology, the examination of the engagement of God with the world, God talk. So what is practical theology? It might be argued, therefore, that all theology is practical theology. Theology which is concerned with the practical business of living. Indeed, the Wesleyan quadrilateral is used as a model for theological reflection, rooted in experience, drawing upon the reading of Scripture by those involved in any given context, recognising the faith tradition of which one is a part, and the traditions which have shaped and informed and continue to shape and inform our understanding of God, and using reason to ask the fundamental question of theological reflection: where is God in all this? Nevertheless, practical theology has emerged as a discipline in its own right, dating from the end of the 18th century. Some would see its roots stretching far further back into the past, tracing them to Aristotle's concept of phronesis, practical wisdom, in contrast to his ideas of theoria, theory, or techne, technical reason. Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834, is frequently considered to be the father of practical theology. Schleiermacher was a pastor and professor of theology at the University of Berlin. He's often remembered for his metaphor of a tree, which he used to demonstrate the three core disciplines of theology and their relationship to each other. The three disciplines he identified are philosophical theology, historical theology, and practical theology. He envisaged philosophical theology as the roots, historical theology as the trunk, and practical theology as the branches, the crown of the tree. Haitink quotes Schleiermacher: "Practical theology is the crown of theological study because it presupposes everything else. It is the final part of the study because it prepares for direct action." Schleiermacher's concept was that theology begins in philosophical study, progresses through historical, and ends with practical outcomes directly related to the work and activity of the Church. Walton indicates that for Schleiermacher, practical theology designates the worship, preaching and pastoral leadership of the Church, which all theology is to serve, and in many ways represents the climax and purpose of the activity of theology. Practical outcomes were crucial. This meant that the study of philosophical and historical theology were to be pursued in order to equip clergy to address the practical issues of the Church's life and mission. In effect, doing theology is solely for the purpose of the outcomes in practice. Haitink again quotes Schleiermacher: "We do not have to limit practical theology to what is actually involved in carrying out the office of ministry. It will include every action in the Church and for the Church for which rules can be given." Practical theology as applied theology. The quote from Schleiermacher above indicates the intimacy of relationship between practical theology and the practice of ministry for Schleiermacher. However, his concept of practical theology was of theology as an applied science which would assist clergy in their ministry. This understanding prevailed until the second half of the last century and is commonly referred to as concerned with providing hints and tips for ministry. There are several serious drawbacks with such a model. It meant that practical theology wasn't considered academic, but instead marginalised. Fowler speaks about it as a basement operation. Departments dealing with pastoral care, church administration, liturgy, evangelism, preaching and such like were literally located in basements or attics. Another problem with this model, pointed out by Campbell, is that the inward-looking focus, equipping the clergy for ministry, did not enable the church to engage with the world, which was changing. The church was not equipped to consider its place and role in the modern world. Furthermore, this model was designed to equip the clergy, but did not address the needs and gifts and ministries of the laity. Nevertheless, Schleiermacher's model has dominated and shaped and continues to shape the study of theology in Europe and North America. Contemporary understanding of practical theology. Since the mid-20th century, the concept of practical theology has changed. According to Haitink, the beginning of modern practical theology can be dated to the 1960s. The understanding of practical theology as theology which is applied to ministry situations is no longer held. Rather, a much more integrative, dialogical, multi-perspectival approach characterises the current understanding of practical theology. As Bevan states, we can no longer speak of culture and world events as areas to which theology is adapted and applied. Culture and world events are the very sources of the theological enterprise, along with and equal to Scripture and tradition. There were various influences which caused this shift to occur. One was philosophy. The influence of philosophy, with a renewed interest in Aristotle's phronesis and an emphasis on knowledge as practical. Three philosophers in particular are worthy of note. Jürgen Habermas. Hughes notes the significance of Habermas's concept of communicative action, in which rational and moral discourse is based on the dynamics that exist in coming to a consensus while engaging in conversation. Paul Ricoeur, his understanding of hermeneutics with his emphasis on human action as text. Haitink comments, Ricoeur extends this theory of interpretation into the vast domain of the social sciences by building a bridge between the interpretation of texts and the interpretation of social reality. Hermeneutics focuses on exegesis, the interpretation of written documents. The concept of understanding that does justice to the interpreting subject, however, provides a legitimate extension to hermeneutics. Text and social reality are thus linked together. And the third is Gadamer and his views on hermeneutics, which were also significant. He maintained that hermeneutics cannot be undertaken without taking the context and history of the reader seriously. The context of the reader will always influence the interpretation. The reader comes to any text with prejudices, prejudgments. It's impossible to completely disengage the two, nor is disengagement desirable. It's important, however, that the reader is aware of their prejudgments and brings them into a critical conversation with the text. Gadamer is known for his concept of the fusion of horizons, the merging of the horizons of the reader and the text, enables a new understanding. Then there's the influence of psychology and the social sciences. Since around the 1920s, practical theology has become increasingly interdisciplinary, especially in relation to psychology, sociology, and anthropology. The insights of psychologists such as Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Carl Rogers were influential. Elaine Graham notes that there was a turn to secular sources of therapeutic knowledge, especially modern psychologies and their corresponding clinical applications. This emphasis came to predominate in the training for ordained ministry in the West during the second half of the 20th century. Anton Boysen's work, which arose from his personal experience of mental illness and conviction that pastoral care could assist the treatment of mental illness, was particularly significant. Boysen, working with Richard Cabot, a psychiatrist, established the Clinical Pastoral Education Movement, CPE. In writing of Boysen's work, Graham comments, "He underlined the non-physical nature of mental illness, establishing the autonomy of the psychological realm and the importance of non-physical factors, familial, psychodynamic, and cultural, in the development of psychiatric distress and disorder." Boysen's emphasis on what he termed the living human document at the heart of the pastoral encounter expressed his conviction that events and situations could be regarded as akin to texts in their potential for interpretation, revelation, and disclosure. This was further developed via a model of educational supervision using verbatim accounts, whereby the student would carefully record the details of a visit or pastoral conversation and reflect on it within the context of a session with a tutor. Then there's the influence of liberationist and feminist theologies. In the mid-1960s, liberation theology emerged in the countries of Latin America. This was grassroots theology, which started from the experience of the poor and oppressed. Gutierrez argued that Christians must recognise and participate in God's preferential option for the poor. Walton says, "For Gutierrez and many others who have discovered or adopted this approach, Christian praxis, aware of the social, political and economic context, is the locus of theology, and that critical reflection on praxis in context is the true nature of theology." Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed was also influential. In his book, Freire argues for a mutual approach to education rather than a banking one, in which the student is thought of as an empty bank waiting to be filled by the teacher. Freire's approach again emphasises the importance of the experience of the person. Feminist theology has had a similarly substantial impact, attending to and starting from the experience of women. The critical element in the contribution of both liberation and feminist theologies to practical theology is their rootedness in experience and their emphasis on liberation and transformation as desired outcomes. So, practical theology and pastoral theology. Confusion can sometimes arise through the use of the terms practical theology and pastoral theology. In the UK and the USA, these are sometimes used interchangeably. However, a pastoral theology is in essence a subdiscipline of practical theology. Other subdisciplines would be subjects such as preaching, religious education, liturgical studies, and such like. Pastoral studies focuses on theological reflection, specifically in relation to pastoral care in the widest sense, encompassing the pastoral ministry of the church, but also personal and communal health. It addresses individuals and communities and both formal or informal care. Arising from this analysis of practical theology, several key elements emerge. First, it engages with the world. It is interested in the world, in the issues of our time. Jesus said, "You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?" Luke 12:56. Practical theology is interested in interpreting the present time. Second, it is interdisciplinary in its approach. Practical theology engages with other disciplines such as psychology, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, the arts, and so on. Any and all disciplines which have a voice to contribute to the issue being explored. Third, it engages with the Christian tradition. This might mean the current tradition of a particular church or denomination, and it might mean engagement with the wisdom and insight from the whole Christian tradition, stretching back to the days of the early church and across all denominations and expressions of Christian faith. It also engages with theological and biblical traditions. Knowledge of theology and biblical studies is foundational for practical theology. These disciplines are an integral part of theological reflection. In the words of Patricia O'Connell-Killen and John de Beer, seeking God's presence involves theological reflection, the artful discipline of putting our experience into conversation with the heritage of the Christian tradition. In this conversation, we can be surprised and transformed by new angles of vision on our experience and acquire a deepened understanding and appreciation of our tradition. In this conversation, we can find ourselves called to act in new, courageous and compassionate ways. Fourth, practical theology engages with experience. It's interested in the concrete, practical experiences of people, communities, movements, nations. Experience is often the starting point for practical theology and theological reflection. We look at experience, at what is going on, and this prompts questions, particularly the question, where is God in all this? Practical theology values people and the experiences of their lives, fulfilling Jesus' commandment to love God and love our neighbour as ourselves. Emmanuel Levinas says, "The respect for the stranger and the sanctification of the name of the eternal are strangely equivalent. All the rest is dead letter." Virgilio Elizondo speaks of practical theology's concern with developing a true spirituality of the sacredness of others, of creating a truly sacred human family wherein no one will be forced to live as an unwelcome alien. No one will be ashamed of the colour of their skin, the shape of their eyes, or the size of their bodies. No one will be denied the basic opportunities of life, and people, institutions and governments will truly care for the welcome of every single person. Thus society will become the temple of the living God. Fifth, practical theology results in outcomes. Practical theology and theological reflection on any given situation always leads to outcomes, to suggestions and possibilities for active response. These outcomes, when acted upon, lead to a new experience, to new possibilities. As Cowan and Lee state, the underlying purpose of practical theological reflection is to sustain a disciplined conversation between a faith community's vision of the world as it should be and the often harsh realities of the world as it is. A conversation that leads to faithful and feasible action. Sixth, practical theology is interested in transformation of mind, body and spirit, of the individual and the community. The aim of practical theology is to make a difference. intentional, focused theological reflection, which has taken into consideration the experience initiating the reflection, which examines the perspectives from the social sciences, which is drawn on theological and biblical studies, church history, and church tradition, and finally suggested outcomes for action, does so in order to change the situation to lead to the possibility of transformation. Robert Schreiter articulates this aim thus: we must take on the form of Christ as Christ took on our form. Finally, Swinton and Mowatt's definition summarises the task of practical theology. Practical theology is critical, theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to ensuring and enabling faithful participation in God's redemptive practices in, to, and for the world. For your own reading and research, to develop your knowledge of this subject further, please see the papers provided on the Moodle page and the titles of the books you will need to read, with links to a site where these can be purchased. There are also instructions on the Moodle page about posting your responses to that reading. Thank you for listening to this video, and I look forward to engaging with you further through your responses to the texts.